I'm going to try to add the jest testing framework for our JavaScript. So following this guide, I'm going to do npm install jest, save it to dev. Here currently we don't have jest, we don't have jest, so if I just paste that here, we should have jest in our dev dependencies show up. And here it is. Then we need jest. So let's also install this. jest, and then install the type definitions for jest. Alright. So we've got jest, types jest, and jest. Writing and running your first test. So why don't we create a tests file with some code in it. Why don't we put that here in a tests folder. Tests. And in there, I'll just say my test.ts. Is that how they did it? Test.ts. And then here I'll do describe. Describe what? Describe string my first test. And then in here you put a test and an expect. So test add and expect that one to be 0. So I can use to be 0. So I can expect. I guess you can return something here. Return 1 minus 1. Okay. How does this work? Then no. Ready to test. Run it with the jest command. Which jest? Is there jest? npx jest. Okay. That received to be expected. Expected 0, and you got a function. Oh, we got to execute that function. Which can't execute a function like this. What does it say? Expected 1 arguments but got 2. Oh, put it around all of this and just call jest, and it passes. Okay, maybe we can add a way to run the test in the package, so we can say test, and this can just do jest. That works. So if I do npm run test, runs the jest. Okay, let's make a bit of a more sophisticated test. What about if we test the sceneManager? So we're going to let's see, what can I test in here? We've got sceneManager, which requires all of these things. And how do we instantiate? We say sceneManager takes an orchestrator. An orchestrator takes a canvas ID, member ID, serialized space, so you really need to create this whole thing, which makes this business a bit hard to test, doesn't it? And why do we need the orchestrator here is because sometimes we're getting access to some of these other things, so we reach into them. All right, we have an orchestrator here, and where's orchestrator? It's being used in 11 places. Well, these are fine. It's just getting these things. So we could pass them in individually. But where else? We're passing it to the XR manager, and we're passing it to the menu manager. Not sure if either of those really need the orchestrator. And then damage overlay this orchestrator. Okay, so what would happen if we didn't pass that along to XR Manager, for example? Let's look in here, XR Manager. It really just makes use of, okay, well, it gets the scene. We need the scene. XR Grip Manager takes an orchestrator. And why do you need the orchestrator? XR Grip Manager. I need the orchestrator because I need the scene, I need the member ID, and I need the XR manager. Okay, this one could be hard to get. sceneManager, XR manager. XR manager. And it is the XR manager. You're setting up a subscription. This subscription equals setup hand and position rotation. What is this thing? It calls something, passing in something, and it subscribes it. Okay. My intention of setting up these tests is to be able to create a story of a list of events, and then I will play it back in a test, and in the back end we'll check that it's persisting correctly. We're building the right data structures. In the front end, we want to see that it creates the right data structures in the front end. So we need something that monitors for Signal Hub, and then after these messages are sent, check to see if their side effects are done. And okay, so we created, added jest to the front end, and now I think we're going to write some tests. So in the rest of this video, how long has this video been? We have done 9 minutes. We will clean up orchestrator. So functions should take simple primitives as arguments. I didn't follow my own rule. Usually I do this. We shouldn't pass complicated things. We should pass simple things into them. Which means we need to go to orchestrate. Whoops. close all these. Yeah, save this, close it. Orchestrator is the biggest offender of this. It passes itself to all of these, which kind of creates maybe a cyclic dependency. We shouldn't do that. Let's start with member states and break that apart. Member states, references to orchestrator. All right, so it needs a member ID, so we could pass a member ID instead. It doesn't have to be a member, so member ID passed in. My member ID is that. And orchestrator, this orchestrator member ID just becomes my member ID. What else? Again, this orchestrator becomes this my member ID. And now we don't need the orchestrator. So then out here, you can just pass member ID. All right, space broker. Space broker takes an orchestrator, and there are 8 references to that. All right, let's remove orchestrator. Then we move orchestrator from here, and we need the member ID. So member ID is a string, space ID is a string, and we'll just assign these. In fact, these could be just made like this, public and public, and remove these things. Duplicate identifier, yes, space ID is not needed here, and it's not needed here. Pause. Okay, continuing here, passing there. Where's the next red line? Where's orchestrator? Here, this orchestrator member states. Okay, so we got to reach over to the member states. My state. Oh, okay. You get your current state from member states. So, at the time you enter, you want the member states. And the way is to jump through orchestrator to get the member states. This is just a comment, so we don't need this. Okay, so orchestrator, this thing is a problem. Okay, member entered, and we want to send the state of member entered. Well, we can just do this somewhere else, right? We could do this in member states. Why do we have to do this here? Send a command to enter or observe after we've joined the channel. So we're listening for camera ready, client ready, and the space channel connected. I don't think we need to listen to camera ready or client ready, right? Because we only get space channel connected here. Okay, the choice comes from client ready, camera ready. Okay, client ready is when you click on the button. Space channel connect is when the channels actually, it came back with a request. And camera ready is something that we get from here. And so, yeah, this doesn't have to be made here at all. Camera ready, client ready, and finally this thing ready. You're sending this on outgoing, but really you could put this anywhere. So camera ready and enter. So if you're entering, you start forwarding that camera movement. Otherwise you don't forward your camera movement. And you'll send some state. Which comes from member state's my state. So there's a my state here. My state. Space broker could alternatively get this function here for my state. So member states initiated first could provide that, but this would have to know about that. And I think that is more complicated than just reproducing the signals on that side. Alright, so space broker needs member ID and space ID. Let's just pass those in since they're pretty simple. Member ID and the space ID. And in here we will just move this last bit into member states. So if I move this, member states also has signal hub here, and in the constructor I'm listening to some things already. Client ready, member states, client ready is false and client ready is true. When are we using client ready? Client ready. If client ready, merge state, member states changed. Init if this client ready. When would you use emit event? This is just if you change anything before you've actually joined. Is that why? Emit event. Let's put that here. We will use combine latest. I think this is combine latest. Space broker. When it was here, combine latest from RxJS. So this is not an operator. Quick fix from RxJS. And we need to define camera ready and client ready. We grab these two and then define them in this space as well. And then over here, do we have this member ID? We say my member ID. And then here it'll just be this. This my state. Send a command after we've joined the channel using my state, and I am the owner of that state, so I will just send it. Camera ready is Signal Hub local on camera ready, and so I think we're already doing that here as well. Camera ready. And client. Wait. Is this camera ready or client ready? It was client ready. Okay, so that shouldn't change any behavior. Going back here, then sceneManager is probably a big one. Let's do WebRTC Manager first. So what do you need Orchestrator for? Orchestrator is used in 6 places. And here it's the member ID and space ID, which we can just pass in. Alright, let's start taking it out. So take it out of here. Take it out of here and just do a public member ID and a public space ID, which is a string. And this is a string. and then you can just say this space ID and this member ID and any other orchestrator. That's it. That was easy. Okay, great. And we can remove some of these unused pieces. So then going back to the orchestrator, member ID and space ID. Member ID, space, this, space ID. Okay. So we're going to try not to instantiate the orchestrator in our test. Finally, sceneManager, this. Alright, so let's get rid of orchestrator here. We'll get rid of this in the constructor. And all of this we'll just prefer to pass in what is the canvas ID? Orchestrator canvas ID. Canvas ID. And even when we start here, the canvas ID here, space canvas. But why call this space canvas? Why not just make it the UUID of the space? One less thing to worry about. Kind of like that idea. Where are we using space canvas? Here. Oh, it's the styling of the ID. It gets the styling. Okay. You could use a class for that. Let's do that. So we'll do dot space canvas, makes it a class. The ID will equal at space ID. Okay, and then over here, we don't need to pass this in at all. Orchestrator does not need a canvas ID. sceneManager does not need a canvas ID. HTML canvas element. I don't think we need to maintain that at all. Okay, so we need the member ID. So we'll just do public member ID is a string. And get rid of this one. And get rid of this one. Then we'll have the serialized space just coming through the orchestrator. Serialized space is a kind of serialized underscore space, so we'll just say public serialized space. It's kind of weird. Get rid of this. get rid of this. Space ID is your own serialized space ID. Does this have a type? What is this thing? It has an ID, entities, and settings. Okay. Pretty good. Canvas. Document get element. This canvas ID would be this space ID as HTML canvas. Fine, we'll put that back. So this is a what? Alright, so put that back. Public canvas is that. Alright, then the engine takes this canvas. I mean, it's not used anywhere else. Let's just do this. Const canvas and canvas. And then you don't need this. Settings becomes that. Okay. So coming back to orchestrator, we're going to pass in, let me save this. We're going to pass in, what is it, member ID, and then the serialized space. Okay, it takes those two things. Alright, sceneManager. Why do you need the orchestrator? sceneManager potentially loads the extended reality, virtual reality stuff. It takes an orchestrator, and what else is using orchestrator? 6 places. We'll remove the first of them. Then remove the second. So we need a scene. Okay, give us a scene. Scene will be a public scene is a kind of Babylon scene. And therefore we don't need this. Correct. And we don't need this line here. Just passing it in. Okay, what else? Then over here, grip manager takes an orchestrator. Now, why does grip manager take an orchestrator? Let's see. Grip manager. You take an orchestrator. You've got 10 places that use it. Okay, so we've got quite a bit of things here. A grip manager looks like it's loaded for each hand. And orchestrator looks like it looks for member ID, and it looks for this function here. Alright, let's remove it. Ooh. So orchestrator here, and we need a scene. That's easy to get, right? I think we can just say public scene. A kind of Babylon scene. Then we don't need this, and we don't need this. What else? It's getting kind of long. Maybe we'll put this on several lines here. Okay, we need the member ID, so pass in the public member ID, which is a string. So now we can just use this member ID. And this is using sceneManager. sceneManager is our parent. But actually we just want this function. We want the setup hand position rotation. And it takes an influencers, and that's just a function, isn't it? we're calling a function, and this function, is it only called an us? Setup. It's defined here, never called by yourself. Okay, it's part of this setup hand position input source. Set up hand position rotation. Well, what does it do? Set up hand position rotation. It takes an input source and then it subscribes. And it makes use of this make XR frame thing. We could just listen for something and then set this up. I think that would be nicer. Okay, so subscription, it sets up a subscription, and then when we unsubscribe, it will tear down the subscription. So we could tear down using messages as well. I mean, if it's only called in here, why pass it back and forth? Just make it in here. And so you have the XR manager define this thing because this thing does make XR frame signal, and this depends on this XR helper base experience. So this is also only in this class. Change this to send the member. Do you have a member ID? XR manager doesn't have a member ID. Now we have a member ID in the orchestrator to send the the sceneManager, please send this member ID and the scene. For that part, this has a member ID. And over here, you will pass the member ID here. And what happens in the scene? Okay, and all this other stuff. Controller, this is control feature. Next, our grip manager. And that's the main error. Then what happens here? Okay, so these are easy to fix. This is just this member ID. This member ID. And over here, this member ID. Alright, so the main thing is how do I get to sceneManager set up hand position with my input source. I could pass in a function. This is probably the easiest way to do. But the bindings are a little bit weird. So if you're in sceneManager and you want to allow somebody to call your function for setup camera movement, maybe you just add a callback here. New grip manager, and then yeah, maybe you set a callback. It's simple and it'll work. I kind of don't like it though. Motion controller on model loaded observable add. And then I want to set up listening on that hand controller. And I only set up listening once the model is loaded. But why don't I pass in something like to allow me to create it? Because this sceneManager grip manager is listening for grips and squeezes, higher level things, and sceneManager is setting up maybe we just add, the callback's not great, but it will allow us to create a subscription. So where's the setup? Set up at the bottom, I think. Publish changes. No, send component data. Setup. So this whole thing returns this subscription. Set up. And we can just call this thing afterwards. So we can say, because it's the same input source, right? So set up this setup hand position rotation with the input source. This would run immediately. We don't want it to run immediately. We want to pass in a function that takes an input source, which is, this is a Babylon WebXR input source. Babylon WebXR input source, and then returns this thing. So we need to add that as a callback of this. So on the last parameter of this thing, we'll add a callback. Callback would be a function that returns a how do you do function signature for a TypeScript function signature for a function? Greeter function. This string returns that thing. Okay. Function input source is a type of Babylon web input WebXR input source, and it returns a subscription. What kind of subscription? It returns a Babylon type of subscription. Setup hand position pause frog. This thing returns a type of, what kind of subscription is this? Subscription from RxJS. RxJS subscription. Okay. Okay. So subscription equals callback. So we call the callback. Alright, so that should be the final thing that works. Hopefully it works. Okay, coming back, XR Manager. Got rid of all orchestrator. Grip Manager. Got rid of all orchestrator. We're back to here with the menu manager. Still has one. And why does menu manager need orchestrator? Menu manager needs orchestrator 11 times because of scene and other things, and these things are passing through. Okay, so we'll pause here and we'll continue here.